the links that we do have with or that many researchers have with the US are very opportunistic links. I discovered something interesting, wanted to take the next step, formed a collaboration with X, who had some technology or access or what have you. And I think, whilst that system works well, having somewhat of a more formal and particularly a more responsive, the classic sort of funding streams, be they US or Australian, are very slow. You need to plan years in advance. But if you've got that, one lovely discovery that you want to take to the next step now, then I think we need some sort of mechanism to have highly responsive, cutting-edge sort of mechanisms in place. So that was sort of the first thing that struck me. The second thing that struck me, and I suppose it's, in any funding or tight funding environment, about getting smarter with what we're doing too. If you look at what's happened with the genomic information and the data sharing, and as a recipient of an NIH grant, if it gets over a certain amount of money, you have to have a plan for how you're going to share that data. I know we've started doing something here, but it's working around the sort of genomic, possibly, or the transcriptomic sort of data. But I think we need to stop a lot of the replication, a lot of the redoing, a lot of the holding on to smaller data sets, in this day and age with the sort of platforms we have, and whether or not, capitalising on what has already been done, what can be shared. I found my interesting protein or whatever. Can I interrogate somebody else's sets of experiments to find out whether or not there's some evidence there, rather than going back to step one, writing an NHMRC grant, redoing all the experiments yourself. So, yeah, mechanisms of being quicker and I think of being smarter will probably be the two things that I came out of today with.
We tend to focus a lot on around direct funding, and there's certainly opportunities and issues that we should discuss around direct funding. But I think collaborations with the US also bring other great opportunities, which are the opportunities for commercialisation, which we may never have as great an opportunity in a country like Australia because of the size. And finally, the opportunities for the research itself, its quality and its impact. And we haven't talked that much about that, but there's incredible data showing about the citation rate of people's work based on on collaboration and what that means on impact recognition and ultimately translation and impact of your work. So I think there are those three areas that I would hope that these US-Australia partnerships will strengthen. The direct funding, today we heard really an amazing amount of people that have been funded from the US, and I do think some more detailed mapping would really be useful about where the sources of that funding and how it's used. We saw some interesting data from Avi before, but I think a little bit more detail about that would be worthwhile. People talk about these very low rates of success in the US, but then there are some targeted areas for funding where there's specific program announcements and specialised areas of funding where RFAs, PAs, where the level of funding are a lot higher than the generalised funding level. So just knowledge about those PAs and RFAs can make a difference. One of the challenges around US funding, most of our employers like it. It's obviously prestigious, it gives you great collaborations, it gives you access to new ideas and opportunities, but actually the indirects on NIH grants are not that high. They're 8% for us in Australia as compared to significantly high for US investigators. And the RIBG that comes back is also not as high, or I don't think it's the same at all as what you get from an NHMRC grant. So I think given the amount of money that is, if we mapped it really well of US funding, it would be a strong argument to the Australian government about some sort of support, which doesn't necessarily have to be directly it's not from the NHMRC, but actually the government itself in supporting the indirects. I think there's a number of ways we can talk about collaborative initiatives. Certainly the NIH have that with a range of other countries. I do think what the Ambassador said this morning was important, that as funding gets lower in the NIH and gets more competitive, the chances of funding to non-US applicants is at risk, and unless there is something that's perhaps a bit more formalised between the US and Australia, we may lose that opportunity. The final thing is about the strategic areas. One big difference about the US funding model to our funding model is that it's heavily strategic in the US. So I think any discussion about strategic areas that we're going to think about within Australia or the NHMRC, it makes sense to align with the strategic areas that are existing in the US, because there is that blanket funding, but then there's some very strategic particular areas.
This was a terrific day. I love coming to these meetings where you hear lots of other people talking about their work, which we don't hear very often. And I must say the quality wasn't bad. It was pretty good. And I suppose if you're talking about all of us who have had funding from the US in various ways, it has to have been at a certain standard, so it goes without saying. Secondly, the thing that impressed me was the incredible range. So we were talking about subcellular signalling, I think at some stage right through to large-scale clinical trials. So we're right up and down the range. So terrific stuff. So that immediately says that the funding is both top quality and extraordinary range, point one. Now, to address the three questions, of course, it's yes, yes, yes. That's a take-home message. It goes without saying. But just to expand on that a trifle, the formal agreements must have formal agreements. No formal agreement falls down. We're never going to get anything done if there isn't a formal agreement. I think the Ambassador made that abundantly clear. What sort of formal agreement? I think that remains to be seen. But which gets into the second point about should we expand the range? And that's where, when you're short of money, can you expand the range? That's a very, very tricky one. You've got obviously areas that have been funded like AIDS, cancer, etc., etc. I think the ideal thing to do would be for NH to get together with NHMRC to talk about what commonality you both have in terms of priorities, and then pick off the top 5 priorities and say they're the ones that we're going to focus on. Because if you focus on everything, you'll end up with no money for anything. That'd be my point about expanding. The final one is one I feel very strongly about, is this bilateral or trilateral or multilateral organisations. And to tell an anecdote about one of our global clinical trials that we had funded by the NHMRC, that we tried to get, we had the British NICE group wanting to fund it, trying to talk to the NHMRC and couldn't get proper linkages with them. It couldn't be done bilaterally. There was some incredible block that we couldn't understand. But what it said to me was, what a wasted opportunity, because I think Ian Fraser was saying we've got to focus a lot of what we do on cutting down the expenditure on health that doesn't work. And to do that, you have to run global clinical trials. To fund global clinical trials, you have to have trilateral, multilateral funding opportunities, and that just does not happen at the moment. I'd like to see a situation where, say, the NHMRC was the initiator, then linked with NICE, then linked with NIH, with the French, and you've suddenly got a global pool of money where you could really do a proper clinical trial to see if something really works or it doesn't. Because it's difficult for one country these days to bear the cost of a clinical trial, and I think it's unnecessarily draining the coffers of single countries. I think a collaborative arrangement with clinical trials must come. How it's going to be done, I think if people from the organisations got together and spoke about it, and this is across 3 or 4 or 5 countries, I think that'd be the way to go.
My background is largely clinical, and I think that Australia represents a unique opportunity for clinical research for a number of reasons, and I think we should think about ways that we can leverage these opportunities based on some unique characteristics within the Australian environment. So firstly, I think in terms of the regulatory environment, there are some possibilities there that make it easier, for example, to do certain types of clinical research, which I think does put us at an advantage. Secondly, we have some populations, and an example of this, from my own experience, would relate to melanoma, where when the pharmaceutical industry wanted to do clinical trials and come to Australia with immunotherapeutics, a lot of the really outstanding early work that was done with Australian clinical researchers, and a significant amount of progress was made just by virtue of the fact that Australia, had the populations that we could contribute to those studies. And then I guess in terms of a lot of the funding that's come to our group over the years, it's come from the philanthropic sector. And that's included the Ludwig Institute, which has invested hundreds of millions over many years, the Cancer Vaccine Collaborative, and then there are others who receive funding from Gates, from the Movember people, from various other agencies. Melanoma Research Alliance has funded a lot of research here as well. So I think when we're thinking a little bit about opportunities, not just in terms of the government agencies, but how we can potentially leverage opportunities from other sectors, including the pharmaceutical industry and including the philanthropic sector, and perhaps when these agreements are thought about, the way in which we could perhaps incorporate or leverage opportunities in addition to core government funding.
Well, I think we've heard today, throughout the day, how many very good outcomes can come from interactions with the US and Australia at both the commercial and government, and also philanthropic, as mentioned. So there are many different possibilities. As well as direct grant support, which of course would be most welcome, but I don't know exactly what mechanism could be used for that. It occurs to me that maybe 1 or 2 areas where there might be useful input would be an increased number of travel grants, for example.
From my experience, there's 2 key things. If there's one take-home message, it's high quality science. It just has to be absolutely internationally competitive, high quality science coupled with high quality relationships with people in the United States that can collaborate with you and work with you. That's it. And I'll give some examples of where that's worked for us. So we've had a seesaw effect where we've helped our collaborators in the United States. The statistics for the Plan B was I think 20%, right? If you yeah, so that one's worked for us. I think we were in that one where we helped collaborators at Seattle BioMed, University of Washington, to win an NIH grant, which they really, it drove high quality science. By the way, you need face time for this. You need time to spend with those people. They learn about your science, they learn about who you are, they learn to trust you. That's a big factor. So we helped them win an NIH grant, some funding came across, and it developed a great seesawing effect where we were able to then apply for grants here locally and win those. We were lucky enough to win those with them as CIs. And then, trust is an issue, and there's the high quality, that high quality relationship of going back and forth was extremely useful for us. I'd commend any scheme, any initiative that would enable more of that. Just as one point, the travel thing, we had Lee Hartwell, who's a Nobel laureate, former director of the Fred Hutch, came to visit Queensland. It was funded by the Queensland government. Lee ended up joining one of our local grants as a CI. It helped us win a significant grant locally. So that sort of high quality relationship, high quality science works. At least it's worked for us. Commercialisation, comment has been made. One of the real limitations here is you do the high quality science, how do you commercialise it? Many of our partners in the United States are really hungry for new intellectual property that they can leverage and make use of in the US. The last point I wanted to make is just philanthropy. Jonathan touched on it. So my institution at the University of Queensland, the Australian Institute of Bioengineering and Nanotechnology, was founded by a $20 million philanthropic donation by an American, Chuck Feeney, who's still one of the largest philanthropic donors for Australian medical research in this country. So, you know, it can happen, and it happens, I think, through high-quality relationships that we should build.